The sentence that ended Oral Fenno's career was about teacups, and Fenno read it 3 times before setting the letter down. It came near the bottom of the 9th letter, after the weather and the school and the small doings of a frontier town Fenno would never see, in the plain unhurried hand of a man who did not know he was being studied. Old Halloran lost his wife to the fever this winter, the schoolteacher had written. 40 years married. He still sets 2 cups at the breakfast table. Pours them both. Drinks his, lets hers go cold, washes them both up, and does it again the next morning. Nobody tells him to stop. What would be the use? He'll set 2 cups until the day he sets 1, and that will be its own kind of morning, and we'll all be there for it. Fenno, who was a xenologist of the Accord, who had spent a long, cool, respected life cataloging how thinking species break, read that paragraph in the pale light of a Velthani study a great distance from any human world, and felt something move that had no place in the catalogue. Because the catalogue was very clear about grief. Grief was the strongest of the shared signals, the one every reckoning was built on. When a people is hurt past bearing, the hurt moves through them, member to member, and they settle together, they yield together, they carry the loss as one body because that is what a thinking species is. Fenno had documented it in a dozen species. Fenno had a whole monograph on the propagation of despair, and it had made Fenno's name, and it was correct, and it was about to be undone by a man in a kitchen washing a cup his wife would never drink from again, alone, in a town that let him do it alone, and did not break, and did not settle, and simply went on. This is the story told in letters, because that is the only way it can be told. 2 people riding across a line neither was allowed to cross, one of them studying the other and slowly forgetting to, the other never once knowing he was the proof of anything. I am going to let them speak for themselves, mostly, because the whole point of what Fenno learned is that it does not survive being summarized. It only survives being heard, one plain sentence at a time, the way Fenno heard it. So here are the letters, or enough of them. Mind the small parts. The small parts are where the whole thing lives. Oral Fenno did not set out to befriend a human. Fenno set out to solve a problem, which is a very different thing, and much safer, and the safety of it lasted about a year. The problem was a hole in the catalogue. The Accord science of the fold rested, as all its sciences did, on the certainty that despair is shared, and for every catalogued species that certainty held, cleanly, measurably. Except that the reports coming back from the human frontier did not fit. Not dramatically. In small ways. A colony that lost a harvest and 1/3 of its people to a bad winter and did not, according to the observers, undergo the settling that loss should produce. A mining town that took a disaster and kept mining. Nothing that made the news of the Accord, because the Accord did not read the small news of the frontier. But Fenno read everything, and Fenno noticed, the way a good scholar notices, that the small things did not add up, and that the not adding up was always in the same direction. So Fenno did what a scholar does. Fenno found a human who could write, and wrote to him. It was not, strictly, permitted. The human arms sat behind a quarantine the Accord did not explain even to its own scholars, and direct correspondence with a frontier human was the kind of irregularity that a career could absorb once and not twice. But there were channels, slow ones, a letter handed ship to ship and taking a season to arrive, and Fenno used them, and chose the correspondent carefully, not an official, who would perform, and not a soldier, who would suspect, but a schoolteacher on a grey little world called Ledgerton, a man named Thomas Reed, whose name appeared on a colonial register as the keeper of the town's small records. Because a person who keeps records is a person who notices, and a person who notices is worth writing to. Fenno's first letter was a careful, scholarly, slightly dishonest thing. It presented Fenno as a chronicler of frontier life, curious about the ordinary rhythms of a colony, gathering material for a study of settlement. All of which was true, and none of which was the truth. The truth was that Fenno wanted to know why Tomas Reed's people did not break the way the catalog said thinking things break, and had decided to find out by the patient, dishonest, scholarly method of asking a man about his life until the man, without meaning to, explained it. It took the better part of a year merely to choose him. Fenno read through dozens of colonial registers first, the dry official lists the Accord kept on every human settlement, looking for a name attached to the right kind of quiet work, and set aside 3 other candidates before Tomas Reed's, each for a small disqualifying reason. One wrote too formally, in the stiff hand of a man performing competence for a superior. One held a post that reported, however loosely, to a company office, and so could not be trusted not to mention the correspondence. To someone who mattered, one, a harbor clerk on a different colony entirely, simply never answered the first careful inquiry, and Fenno never learned why, and thought of him afterward, now and again, with an idle and unscholarly regret. Tomas Reed answered inside a season, in a hand that had plainly never once been taught to perform for anybody, and that, more than any qualification on the register, was what decided it. Tomas Reed wrote back within the season, which is to say as fast as the channel allowed. His letter was not careful and not scholarly and not dishonest in any particle. It was warm. He seemed genuinely pleased that a foreigner, and such a foreigner, from so far up the long ladder of the galaxy, wanted to hear about Ledgerton, which he clearly loved and clearly knew nobody important had ever cared about. He answered every question and asked twice as many back. He wanted to know what Fenno's world was like, whether it was true the Velthani lived 1,000 years, whether it was cold where Fenno was, what Fenno ate, whether Fenno had children. He signed it, with real gladness for the letter, and the hope of more, T. Reed. Fenno read it and felt the first small crack in the safety of the arrangement, because it is one thing to study a species and another to be asked, kindly, whether it is cold where you are. From the correspondence of A. Fenno and T. Reed, Ledgerton Colony, arranged in order. The scholarly annotations in the margins are Fenno's own, made and then, later, crossed out. Here is the first real exchange in full, because it sets the key the rest of the correspondence is played in. Oral, your second letter found me in the middle of planting, which is our excuse this time of year for putting off any task less important than the potatoes, and I read it standing in the mud with my boots making a sound like a bad joke, and grinned the whole way through. You ask what an ordinary week looks like here, so I will tell you, though I warn you it will sound like nothing at all, because it is nothing at all, and that is most of what a life is made of, in my experience, wherever you are writing from. Monday the well committee met about the well, which does not need a committee, but Ledgerton is a town of 400 souls and every one of us has an opinion about water, and the meeting ran 2 hours past the time it should have taken 10 minutes, and I sat in the back and watched Del Aiken and old Ordell Vance argue about a pump handle with the seriousness other men save for wars. Tuesday it rained the good kind of rain, the kind that comes down straight instead of sideways, and the children could not sit still for it, and neither, truthfully, could I. Wednesday the dog that has decided the schoolhouse belongs to her had 6 pups under the porch, which she did not consult me about, and I have already promised 4 of them to families before their eyes are properly open, because that is how promising works out here. Thursday I taught the times tables to the ones old enough to need them and read the little ones a story about a fox, twice, because the first time none of them believed the ending and made me prove it. Friday Halloran brought a pie to the schoolhouse that his wife Selah had baked too much of on purpose, though she always swears it was an accident, and we ate it on the step in the last of the light, and it was, Oral, I promise you, the best thing that happened to me all week, better than any of the news from the capital that comes in a season late on the ship and matters less than it thinks it does. That is the week. I told you it was nothing. Write and tell me something true about wherever you are, if you are permitted. I would rather hear one true small thing than 100 large ones dressed up for a stranger. With real gladness for the letter, and the hope of more. T. Read. Fenno's answer took the better part of a season to arrive, the way they all did, and was a more careful document than the one that prompted it, and is worth setting down whole, because you can watch a scholar deciding, sentence by sentence, how much of himself to risk. Tomas, I confess your account of the well committee produced in me something I can only describe as delight, which is not an emotion a working xenologist is generally called upon to report experiencing over a pump handle, and I will ask you not to mention it to my colleagues, an instruction you will have no trouble following, since none of them will ever read a word you write. You ask for something true about where I am. Here is one. It is winter through most of the year in this part of my world, mild by the measure of your winters and serious by the measure of mine, and there is a grey lichen that grows on the north face of every stone in this district, and I have spent more hours than I will admit, as a young scholar, studying its manner of growing, on the theory that a slow thing, watched closely enough, will teach you more than a fast one ever does. I still hold that theory. I notice I am beginning to apply it to your letters as readily as to lichen, which is a piece of self-knowledge I offer you honestly and examine rather less honestly myself. I will add, for the scholarly record you did not ask for and that I will stop pretending I am not keeping, that a committee convened in all seriousness over a pump handle strikes me, on reflection, as a healthier civic instrument than anything my own people have produced in an equivalent span of history. Do not tell your well committee I said so. It would only encourage them. I find myself compelled to add against my own better professional judgment, real gladness for the letter, and the hope of more. A. Fenno. That exchange set the shape of the whole first year, repeated a dozen times over with different weather and different small news, Fenno's letters growing by degrees less careful and Tomas's growing, if anything, more dear for staying exactly the same. Tomas wrote about the school, letter after letter, the way that first one had promised he would. He had 16 pupils that year and taught them all in one room, the little ones and the near-grown together, and he wrote about them with the particular love of a man who had not had children of his own and had decided the towns would do. He wrote about the weather, which on Ledgerton was mostly grey and occasionally, gloriously, not. He wrote about the harvest, and the ore the town dug in a small way, and the arguments at the town meeting that never seemed to end and never seemed to matter less for that, and the same dog, forever expanding her claim on the schoolhouse porch, one pup's worth of territory at a time. And Fenno, reading, annotated. In the margin of the letter about the 16 pupils, in a cool scholarly hand, note the effective investment in non-kin young, consistent with the species' documented tendency to distribute attachment widely. In the margin of a letter about a boy who had drowned in the spring floods, and how the town had grieved, observe, grief present, intense, but note the absence of the settling response. The town mourns, the town does not fold. Investigate. He was, at this stage, still a scholar with a subject. The annotations are steady, curious, a little cold. He was watching Tomas read the way you watch a specimen, and Tomas Reed was writing to a friend, and the gap between those two things was the whole tragedy of it, and Fenno did not yet feel it as a tragedy. Fenno felt it as progress. Then, in the second winter, the fever came to Ledgerton, and everything Fenno thought the correspondence was became something else. Tomas Reed's letters through that winter are the heart of it, and they are almost unbearable to read in order. Here is enough of them, and no more, because they were not written to be evidence and it feels like a second theft to use them as evidence, which is the exact thing Fenno came to feel, which is the whole point. The first one is short. Oral, forgive the brief letter. We have sickness in the town, a fever come in on the autumn ship, and it is bad, and I am needed. The school is closed. I am carrying water and sitting with people. I will write properly when I can. Don't worry for me, I am strong as the dog. T. The second is not short, and it is not steady, and Fenno, reading it a season later in the cool of the Velthani study, learned for the first time what it was to receive grief in the mail from a friend and be able to do nothing at all across the distance but read. Oral, it has been 6 weeks and the fever is going now, out the way it came, and it has taken more of us than I can stand to write in a line, so I will not put a number, because a number is a wrong thing to make of them. I will tell you instead about them one at a time, over the letters to come, because that is the only true way to say who we lost, and I find I need to say it, and you are the one far enough away that I can say it to without watching it land on your face. I will start with the Ames girl, who was 6, and in my school, and who could not sit still for anything but a story. Then there is Ordell Vance, who taught himself 3 tongues out of old shipping waybills because he liked knowing exactly what a label meant more than he liked most people, and who kept bees and lectured them daily on their responsibilities, in the sincere belief that a bee spoken to reasonably will not sting you, which I can report from personal experience is not true, though it never once shook his believing it. He is buried out past the east field, and the bees are still there, and nobody has had the heart to tell them anything has changed, and I begin to think nobody needs to. And Selah Halloran, who made 4 pies when the occasion called for one, on purpose, though she always swore it was an accident, and who sang the wrong words to every hymn to see if the Reverend would ever notice, which he never did, not once in 40 years. She is the reason her husband sets 2 cups at his table now, and I will write to you about that directly, because it is the truest thing I have seen since the fever came, but I find I am not ready yet, so let me finish the others first. And Prue Aiken, Dell's wife, who left behind her boy and her girl and a kitchen she had only just finished painting the color of a robin's egg, a color Dell cannot look at yet and has not found the courage to paint over, though I expect he will, in time, because a man cannot live forever inside a color his wife chose for him. The children are with his mother now. They ask after her the way children do, plainly, without knowing yet that the plainness is the hardest part of it to hear. And there is Cass Dorney, who was set to marry Lem Oster in the spring, and whose wedding dress her mother had already taken in twice and was letting out one final time when the fever came, and which now hangs finished and unworn in a closet nobody has had the heart to open, because Lem asked that it stay exactly where it is, for reasons he has not explained to anyone and nobody has asked him to. And there are others I have not the room to give you properly in one letter, and will give you across the next several, because I find, oral, that I cannot set them down quickly, and would not want to if I could. It would feel like carrying them out to the field in a wheelbarrow instead of on my own back, one at a time, the way a person should be carried. He went on like that, letter after letter, across that whole terrible season and into the spring after, telling Fenno his dead one at a time, name by name, small true detail by small true detail, the way you tell a rosary. Not as a mass. Not as a toll. As people, each one held up singly to the light and turned so Fenno could see the particular shape of the loss. He never once gave a number. He gave names, and what each of them could not sit still for, or lecture their bees about, or paint their kitchens the color of, and who was left behind, and what that person was doing now. Tomas had written, too, of how the town buried them, and it was itself a piece of the proof, though he did not know it and Fenno was slow to see it. Ledgerton did not hold one funeral for its dead, because a grief that size does not fit in one room. It held many small ones, spread across many afternoons, each household seen into the ground in its own time by whichever neighbors could bear to come, and the baker kept baking, and the well committee kept meeting about the well, absurdly, doggedly, because someone had to, and it turned out the town's stubborn ordinary business was itself a kind of mercy, a reason to get up that did not require the whole of Ledgerton to feel the same thing at the same hour. Grief did not travel house to house on Ledgerton the way a fire does. It stayed lit only where it started, and went out only when the person carrying it could bear to let it, and no one else's darkness made any other window go dim. By the third of these letters Fenno had stopped annotating in the margins at all. There was a separate sheet by then, kept apart from the file, because it no longer felt permissible to write a scholarly note beside a friend's account of the dead, and the word friend had entered Fenno's own private accounting somewhere in that same stretch of weeks without ever being formally admitted. The sheet survives. 3 times on it Fenno began the sentence observe, subject reports, and 3 times struck it through before finishing it, the third strike hard enough to tear the paper. There is a long gap in the hand between the second strike through and the third, longer than a scholar comfortable with the sentence would have needed, and then, underneath it, in a hand that had stopped pretending to be a scholar's hand at all, is the sentence Fenno finally let stand. It reads, "I am sorry, Tomas. I am so sorry. I do not know how to say this so that it reaches you across the distance it has to cross, and I am going to send the letter anyway, because saying nothing is worse." And oral Fenno, reading on toward the annotation that mattered most, the one the whole study had quietly been built to produce, found the cool scholarly hand simply would not come. It had started to shake somewhere on that sheet, and it did not fully steady again for the rest of the correspondence. Because here was the thing. Here, in these letters, was the exact phenomenon the catalogue said could not exist. A town had been hit past bearing. By every measure in Fenno's science, Ledgerton should have settled, should have undergone the collective fold, the shared giving way, the moment where a people, unable to carry the law separately, carries it together and is thereby broken together and could be, if someone wished, defeated together. That was the law. That was the thing every reckoning in the galaxy was built on. Ledgerton did not settle. Fenno could see it, letter by letter. The town grieved, enormously, unmistakably, more than Fenno's cold science had ever conveyed. But the grief did not pool. It did not move from house to house and gather into one breaking thing. It stayed where it fell. Each household carried its own dead, alone, in its own kitchen, and the town around it did not take the weight up and did not break under it, because there was no channel for the weight to travel. Tomas told his dead one at a time because that was the only way they existed, one at a time, in separate rooms, in separate people, never gathered into a single grief that could be pushed past a single threshold. There was no threshold. That was the discovery. There was no single scale you could pile a human town's losses onto until the whole town tipped, because the town was not, in the way every other catalogued species was, a single thing that could tip. It was 10,000 separate rooms, and you could darken them one at a time forever and the others would still be lit, because the light in one room was never the light in the next. Halloran set 2 cups. And the town let him, and did not break, and went on. Fenno crossed out every annotation in the file. Went back through a year of letters and drew a line through every cool scholarly note, every specimen and observed the subject, because you cannot keep calling a man a subject once he has mailed you his dead and trusted you to carry them a little. What Fenno did next was the thing a scholar cannot not do, which is to write it down. The first draft of the monograph was written in a kind of fever of its own, in the weeks after the last of the Ledgerton letters, and it was the best thing Fenno had ever made. It was quiet and it was rigorous and it was true, and it took the great load-bearing certainty of the entire accord, that despair is shared, that a people can be broken as a body, and it showed, carefully, with a frontier schoolteacher's letters as its evidence, that in one species this was simply not so. It had not come easily, or not in the shape it finally took. The earliest attempt tried to frame the finding as a variance within the existing law, a peculiarity of scale, a slower propagation rather than no propagation at all, the kind of correction a careful scholar makes to a good theory rather than a demolition of it, because Fenno had spent 2 centuries inside that theory and some part of him wanted very badly for it still to be standing when the paper was done. That draft did not survive a single honest rereading. The evidence would not sit inside it. Tomas's letters kept refusing to describe a slow fold, they described no fold at all, a town with no gathering place for its grief to gather in, and a theory that only bends around evidence like that is not a correction, it is a lie dressed as caution. Fenno tore the framing out and began again, and the second attempt was honest and was also unreadable, a thicket of qualification, because honesty about a thing this large is frightening to commit to plainly. It took a third attempt, and the discipline of 200 years of writing for other scholars, to find the plain sentence the finding actually deserved. In simple terms, Fenno wrote, near the end, in the plain landing every good monograph needs, in every catalogued species, grief is a shared state, and so there exists a point past which the whole population yields, because the whole population feels the same unbearable thing at the same time. In humans, grief is not shared. It is born singly, in separate persons, and does not propagate between them. There is therefore no point at which a human population yields as one, because there is no state that a human population is ever in as one. You may break any number of them. The rest do not receive it. They have no channel to receive it through. A human town does not have a threshold because a human town is not, in the relevant sense, a single thing. And then, because Fenno was honest, and because a scholar writes the consequence even when the consequence frightens him, Fenno wrote the next sentence, the one that turned the monograph from a discovery into a danger. This has a consequence for doctrine, Fenno wrote. The entire practice of the fold assumes a threshold. Against humans there is no threshold to find. It follows that the fold cannot be applied to them at all, that they cannot be defeated in the ordinary way, by the application of force past a break point, because they have no break point to pass. They can only be reduced, one at a time, without limit, to the last of them. I do not write this to recommend it. I write it because it is true, and because someone will eventually notice it is true, and I would rather it were noticed by a scholar than discovered by a fleet. Fenno tried, before setting the pen down, to picture what the sentence actually meant, translated out of a scholar's careful conditional and into the plain future it pointed toward. It meant a marshal on some ordinary morning reading this very paragraph in a briefing packet and understanding, correctly, that there was no longer any shame in going all the way to the end of a human world, because going all the way to the end was no longer a failure of doctrine, it was the only doctrine left once the fold had been subtracted from the equation. It meant some other Ledgerton, taken not gallery by gallery or ship by ship but person by person, methodically, past the point the accord had always called mercy and called it that only because it had never once been required to find out what lay past it. It meant Halloran's kitchen with no one left in it to set even the one cup, and the bees at Ordell Vance's hives with no one left to lecture them, and the robin's egg paint in Prue Aiken's kitchen with no one left alive to be unable to look at it. Fenno had spent 2 centuries proud of never once having missed a calculation. This was the first time being right felt like the worst thing Fenno had ever done. Fenno read that last paragraph, and understood exactly what had been written, and set the draft down, not face down, not with any drama, just down, flat on the desk in the pale light, and sat with it for a long time, because Fenno had just written, in the clearest prose of a distinguished career, the precise instructions for the one thing the accord had spent 100,000 years not doing to anybody. The accord did not commit genocide. It was proud of that. It defeated species without destroying them, that was the whole moral architecture of the fold, the thing that let it call itself a civilization and not a butcher. Genocide was obscene waste, the mark of a miscalculation. But the reason the accord did not destroy species was not mercy. It was that it never had to. Every species could be folded, so folding was always the cheaper, cleaner, more civilized road, and the Accord took it and congratulated itself on its restraint. And Fenno had just proved, in a monograph any reckoner could read, that there was a species that could not be folded. That the cheaper, cleaner road did not exist for them. That the only road to their defeat was the one the Accord called obscene, all the way to the last of them, and that a civilization which had never once had to choose between its mercy and its victory was, the day it read Fenno's monograph, going to have to choose, and Fenno did not trust it to choose the way it flattered itself it would. Fenno submitted the monograph, because that is what a scholar does, and because a small brave part of Fenno believed the truth was safer in the light than in a drawer. The Guild's first response came back in a season, and it was a single line clipped to the returned manuscript, in the hand of a senior reader named E04, whom Fenno had known for 200 years and trusted more than anyone else still living. Oral, this is the best work you have done, and it must not circulate. Come and see me. It was not signed with a name, only with the reader's mark, which was itself a kind of message. This is not a matter for names. They met in a quiet room high in the Guild's old tower, the kind of room built before anyone living could remember it being built, with a single narrow window that looked out over grey rooftops and told you nothing useful about the hour. Vrahi had the manuscript on the table between them, every page of it, and Fenno saw before either of them spoke that she had read it more than once, because the margins were dense with her own small precise hand, and none of it was crossed out. She did not argue with a word of the monograph, which was the worst part. She agreed with all of it. She had checked the reasoning line by line, the way only a reader of her rank was permitted to, and the reasoning held, and that was precisely the problem. You are right, she told Fenno. That is not in question. You are right, and you have proved it, and if this circulates, then within a generation every reckoner in the Accord knows that there is a species that cannot be folded, and knows what that leaves as the only alternative, and I have spent a long life in this Guild, Oral, and I do not believe the Accord will do the merciful thing with that knowledge. I believe it will do the arithmetic. It always does the arithmetic. That is what it is. And the arithmetic, once the fold is off the table, points one way, and it points there for a whole species, and you and I will have handed it the pointing finger. Then let it circulate under caution, Fenno said, reviewed only within the Guild, argued over properly, before anyone outside it ever sees a page of it. Burying it changes nothing about whether it is true. It only changes who learns of it, and when, and I would rather it be argued over now, by people capable of arguing, than found later by someone with no one left to argue with. There is no argument that unlearns a fact once a fleet has it, Vrahi said. You know this better than most, Oral. You have spent your whole career teaching students that a datum, once released into the world, cannot be called back into the drawer. I am not proposing an argument. I am proposing that the drawer stay shut a while longer, because the moment it opens even a crack the fact is loose, and a fact of this size does not stay confined to careful readers. It reaches the fleet within a season and the War College within a generation, precisely as you have written it will, and no committee of cautious scholars stands between those 2 points once the first page leaves this tower. The truth, Fenno began. The truth, the reader said, is that a man on Ledgerton sets 2 cups at his table, and his town lets him, and does not break. That is the truth, and it is beautiful, and it is the most dangerous sentence anyone in this Guild has written in 10,000 years, and I am asking you, as your friend and not as your senior, to let me seal it. Not burn it. Seal it. Put it where the dangerous true things go, and let the Accord stay wrong about humans a little longer, because the Accord being wrong about them is, right now, the only thing keeping them alive. And when it is found? Fenno asked. A seal is not a grave, Ilka. You taught me that yourself, in this same tower, a long time ago. Someone will read it eventually. Some patient mind will lay it beside enough other strange reports and see the shape of what we are hiding. Then let it be found by a patient mind, Vrahi said, in some year neither of us will live to see, when the finding of it is a different question asked by different people, and not by a marshal with a campaign already underway who needs only one clean citation to justify what he already intends to do. I am not offering you safety forever, Oral. Nothing offers that. I am offering you the only thing sealing ever offers, which is time, and the hope that whoever inherits the question is wiser than the ones asking it today. It is not much. It is what there is. And Fenno, who had wanted the truth in the light, sat in the quiet room and understood that Vrahi was right, and that this was the trap of it. The truth that would make Fenno's name was the truth that would paint the target, and there was no version of publishing it, however carefully hedged, that did not, somewhere down the line, end with a fleet doing the arithmetic Fenno had shown it how to do. The monograph was sealed. Draft 1, marked withhold. Draft 2, the revision Fenno could not stop making because a scholar cannot stop refining a true thing even after it has been condemned to a drawer, marked do not circulate. Draft 3, the last, the cleanest, marked sealed, and put away in the place the guild kept the things it could not afford to know it knew. It was the finest work of Fenno's life, and no one would ever read it, and Fenno had agreed to that, and it was the right thing, and it was a kind of death. A sealed thing is not a destroyed thing, and the Velfani, of all species, should have known the difference, because they were the ones who kept the archives, and an archive is only a very patient way of not quite forgetting. The monograph went into the sealed collection, and the sealed collection went on existing, because the guild could not bring itself to burn the best work of one of its own even when it could not bear to read it. And a sealed thing in an archive is a shape. It is a hole with edges. Anyone who ever went looking, later, through the guild's records, would find a gap where a monograph should be, a citation to a work marked sealed, a title, on the non-propagation of grief in the Terran species, Fenno, and nothing behind it but a seal and a date. Fenno knew this. Fenno had spent a life in archives and knew that the surest way to make a future scholar find a thing was to seal it, because scholars are drawn to seals the way water is drawn downhill. Somewhere ahead, Fenno understood, there was going to be someone whose whole work was the noticing of shapes in the record, a person who laid strange documents side by side and read the gaps between them, and that person was going to find a marshal's after-action report with a blank where a number should be, and a salvage crew's testimony that made no sense, and a schoolteacher's town that would not settle, and, sealed among them, a monograph that explained all three in the plainest prose in the archive. The seal would not hold against that person. Nothing holds against that person. That is what that person is for. Fenno carried the last draft to the sealed collection alone, on a grey morning much like any other, past shelf after shelf of things the Accord had decided it could not afford to know. The archivist on duty did not ask what it was. She had long since stopped asking. She took the folder, entered the title into a ledger in a hand as steady as Vrahi's had been, stamped it, and set it on a shelf indistinguishable from 1,000 others, and Fenno stood there a moment longer than the business required, the way a person stands at a grave a moment longer than the burying requires, and then walked out into the grey morning and went home and wrote to Tomas about the weather. But that was ahead, and it was not Fenno's to see. What was Fenno's, in the meantime, was a single remaining choice, the only one the seal had left unmade, what to do about Tomas Reed. Fenno could have stopped writing. It would have been the safe thing, the scholarly thing, the clean end to an irregular correspondence that had already cost more than it should. The study was over, the finding was sealed, the subject had served his purpose and could be released back into the ordinary obscurity of the frontier, never knowing he had been a subject at all. Fenno did not stop writing. The last letters between Oral Fenno and Tomas Reed are not about grief, and they are not about the fold, and they are not, in any line, about the monograph that Tomas would never know existed and that had used his dead as its evidence and been sealed to protect his town. They are about nothing. That is what makes them the most important documents in this whole account. They are about the dog that runs the schoolhouse, and the weather on Ledgerton, which was grey and once, gloriously, not. They are about Tomas's 16 pupils, one of whom had started writing poems that were terrible in a way Tomas found unaccountably moving. They are about whether it was cold where Fenno was, and what Fenno ate, and whether the Velthani really lived 1,000 years, and if so, Tomas wanted to know, gently, in the plain hand, did it get lonely, all that time, and did you find that the trick of it was the same as the trick of any life, which was to love the small things while they were in front of you? Here is one such exchange, kept whole, because it is worth more than any summary of it. Oral, the dog has taken to sleeping directly across the schoolhouse doorway, so that a man cannot enter his own school without stepping over her, which she considers a small price for the privilege of being stepped over by everyone she loves, and I have stopped fighting it, because I notice I step more carefully now, going in and out, and a man could do worse than be made careful by a dog. The weather has been grey for the better part of a month, in the way it manages here, and then yesterday it was not, for about an hour in the afternoon, and half the town found some reason to be standing outside for that hour, myself included, doing nothing at all but being warm. I have to tell you about young Sarn Betts, who is 10 and has decided, without any encouragement from me beyond the ordinary kind, that he is a poet. He has written a poem about the Well Committee. I am going to copy it out for you exactly as he gave it to me, because I could not improve on it if I tried for a year, and I have tried, in secret, out of sheer professional jealousy, and failed. The well is full of water and the men are full of talk. And the water does not care and neither does the well. And someday the men will be full of water too. And the well will still be there, being a well. I do not know what to tell you about that poem except that I read it to myself 4 times the evening he handed it in, and each time I liked it better and understood it less, and I have decided those 2 things are allowed to happen at once, in a poem or in a life. Write and tell me whether it is cold where you are, and whether you eat anything worth eating, and whether, after so many years of it, the trick of a long life is the same as the trick of a short one, which I have come to believe is only this: love the small things while they are in front of you, because they will not wait for you to notice them properly, and neither, I am sorry to say, will the rest of us. With real gladness for the letter, and the hope of more. T. Tomas, I have read the Well Committee poem more times than I will admit in writing, and I agree with every word of your assessment of it, including the part where you understood it less each time you liked it more, which is, I have come to think, the only honest description anyone has ever given me of what a good poem does. Tell Master Betts that a foreign scholar of considerable age found it the finest thing to cross his desk this year, and do not tell him which year, or how long a year is where I write from, or he will ask questions I would enjoy answering and am not permitted to. It is cold where I am, Tomas, in the particular grey way I described to you once before, and I eat plainly, and yes, before you ask again, we do live a very long time, longer than is entirely good for a person, I sometimes think, though I would not trade the years I have had for fewer of them, not even the difficult ones, and perhaps especially not those. You ask if the trick of a long life is the same as the trick of a short one. I have turned that question over for the better part of a season, which will not surprise you, since you have caught me before it taking the long way round a simple answer, and I find I agree with you entirely, though I would put it more plainly than you did, because you are the one who taught me plainness as a youth scholarship mostly forgets. The trick is the small things. It was always the small things. I only ever thought it was the large ones, and I was wrong about that for longer than I care to admit, and you are, in no small part, the reason I no longer am. With real gladness for the letter, and the hope of more. A. That was the shape of the last letters, exchange after exchange like that one, for as long as the correspondence ran. Fenno never told Tomas that he had proved a law of the universe. Fenno never told him that a widower's 2 cups had unmade the science of 100,000 years. Fenno never told him that far away, in a sealed room, there was a monograph with his town's dead in it, written and buried by a friend to keep a fleet from ever doing the arithmetic. Fenno told him about the frost on a Velthani morning, and kept asking after the Well Committee poem for months afterward, a running joke it had quietly become between them without either one ever deciding it should, and signed the letters, at the end, not with scholarly regard, which is how they had started, but the way Tomas signed his, with real gladness for the letter, and the hope of more. The great work of Fenno's life sat sealed in the dark. And the letters went on, season after season, ship to ship, 2 people writing to each other about nothing across a line neither was allowed to cross, one of them having chosen, in the end, the friend over the finding, the person over the paper, the 2 cups over the law they proved. It was the wrong choice for a scholar. It was the only choice for a person. Fenno had spent a life being a scholar, and spent the end of it, quietly, being a person, and counted it, in the private ledger no guild would ever read, as the better bargain. I told you to mind the small parts, because that is where the whole thing lies, and now that you have heard it, let me tell you the smallest and truest part of all. Tomas Reed never knew. That is the thing I need you to sit with. He lived out his life on Ledgerton, teaching the town's children in one grey room, keeping the town's small record of who was and who is, writing his letters to a foreigner he had come to love, and he died, in the ordinary fullness of time, never once knowing that his ordinary letters had proved the most dangerous truth in the galaxy, or that a friend far away had buried that truth to keep him in his safe, or that a widower's 2 cups, described in the 9th letter after the weather in the school, had reached across the whole cold ladder of the accord and taken apart the certainty the entire order was built on. He thought he was writing to a lonely scholar who liked to hear about his town. He was right about that, as far as it went. He never knew how far it went. He was never told. He was never going to be told. That was the last mercy, and Fenno gave it to him, and it cost Fenno the truth, and Fenno paid it gladly. Oral Fenno was not a hero, and would have found the word embarrassing, and would have pointed out, correctly, that a hero publishes and a coward seals, and that by the plain accounting of the guild Fenno had done the coward's thing. But there is an older accounting than the guild's, and by that one Fenno saw, more clearly than any reckoner ever did, what the accord could not afford to see, that the thing which made humans impossible to fold was not strength, and was not defiance, and was not any quality you could admire from a distance and put in a catalogue. It was that they grieved alone. That each of them carried their own dead in their own kitchen, 1 cup at a time, and the town let them, and did not break, because there was no channel for the breaking to travel. It was the loneliest thing in the galaxy, and it was the thing that could not be defeated, and Fenno, who had spent a life cataloguing how thinking things break, was the first mind of the accord to understand that here was a thinking thing that broke only 1 room at a time, and could therefore be killed but never folded, and had better, for all their sakes, be left uncatalogued a while longer. The monograph stayed sealed. The letters went on. And somewhere on a grey world that no history would ever name, a schoolteacher wrote to his friend about a dog and the weather and a boy's terrible poems, and set the letter to go out on the next ship, and never knew that he was, in his own plain unknowing hand, the reason a scholar of the accord had looked at the truth of what his people were and decided the galaxy was not yet fit to hear it. Halloran set 2 cups until the morning he set 1. The town was there for it, as promised. And far away, in a sealed room, the truest thing anyone had ever written about human beings waited in the dark for the one reader it would someday, inevitably, find, because seals do not hold forever, and the accord's whole long piece was built on a hole in the record exactly the shape of a man washing a cup his wife would never drink from again.